Hello, everyone. My name is Mehmet Gurses. I'm a professor of political science in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida. I'm also director of Kurdish Political Studies Program, housed in the same School of Politics. The Kurdish Political Studies Program was initially formed by a generous donation from Dr. Necmettin Kerim back in 2015. Today, we are here to talk about the most recent elections in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. About a week ago, on October 20th, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is an autonomous region in northern Iraq bordering Turkey and Iran, held its long-awaited parliamentary elections. More than 70% of nearly 3 million registered voters participated in these elections. Despite some irregularities and some concerns, the elections were largely democratic and peaceful. Today, I have with me an expert on all of this, Shivan Fazil, to discuss the significance of these elections as well as the broader implications of these elections for the Kurds and the Kurdistan region. But let me first introduce Shivan briefly before I get to my questions for Shivan. Shivan has worked with the Institute of Regional and International Studies at the American University of Iraq, as well as United States Institute of Peace. He was with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute between 2020 and 2024. He is currently a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at Boston University. He is focusing on governance, state-society relations, peace and conflict dynamics, with a focus on Kurds and the broader region. So, Shivan, thank you very much. I would like to welcome you in Kurdish. Rojbash de bkhair hati.
Rojbash Seda, Galak Spas. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, Shivan. So let me start with a general question for our audience and viewers to put everything in a context. So please give us a summary of multi-party elections in the Kurdistan region, because I understand that the most recent elections were not the first elections in the Kurdistan region.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a great point to start. The multi-party elections in the Kurdistan region goes back to 1992, when the region, the semi-autonomous region of the Kurdistan region, first held elections in 1992 after Iraq's defeat from the Gulf War. The international community, to protect the Kurds, established a no-fly zone on the north of Iraq, and that led to the withdrawal of the Ba'ath Party's apparatus, security, and governance structures. So in its stead, the Kurdish movement at the time, led by the two principal parties, KDP, Kurdistan Democratic Party, and PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and other parties, decided to hold elections for the Kurdistan region and thereby establish a parliament and also form a government to self-rule the Kurdish areas in northern Iraq. So that was the first elections in 1992. However, soon after, or only 2 years later, disagreements between the two principal parties at the time and to date, KDP and PUK, over the election results, but also due to resource sharing competitions, led to the breakout of civil war in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and thereby suspended the normalcy that had been established in the wake of the Gulf War. And the parliament was basically put into recess, and that lasted, or the civil war raged until 1998, when a US brokered treaty that's known as Washington Accord ended hostilities between the two parties. But at the same time, it led to the splitting of the Kurdistan region of Iraq into two parts, and thereby two separate one-party-led administrations, one in the north of the region, in Erbil and Duhok, led by the KDP, and the other one in the eastern part of the region, led by the PUK. And the situation remained there the same until 2006, when the multi-party parliamentary elections resumed after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that was when basically the Kurds, incentivized by the changes in that in the broader Iraq and the toppling of the Ba'ath regime, they resumed, or the two parties agreed to merge their two one-party-led administrations, and thereby the necessity of holding parliamentary elections. So that was after 13 years of hiatus, from 1992, the first parliamentary elections, to 2005, the second parliamentary elections that took place. And I think from 2005 onward, the parliamentary elections have been a regular feature in Kurdish politics in Iraq, albeit not necessarily timely. So we have seen all the elections since 2005, for example, in 2013, and also in 2018, and also most recently in 2014, that was originally due in 2022, to happen regularly, but not necessarily on time. So there is a history in the Kurdistan region of having multi-party parliamentary elections that goes back to 1992 for the first parliament, but then there was a 13 years of hiatus because of the civil war and the splitting of the region into two one-party-led administrations.
Wonderful. So I think when we talk about democratic elections in a place like Kurdistan, I believe we need to contextualize this, because we are not talking about elections in the middle of Europe or in Northern America. This is not necessarily a part of the world that is known for holding peaceful democratic elections. So what would be the significance of these elections for the Kurds? Because I understand, as you mentioned, these elections were supposed to take place about 2 years ago, and they were postponed, delayed for a number of reasons. Yet there were some serious concerns that these elections may not even take place, that there may actually another political violence or civil war might break out between the major parties in Iraqi Kurdistan. But my understanding is that it was a generally peaceful and democratic elections. What does that tell us about the Kurdish politics in Iraq?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's was a very smooth process and competitive. And I think both the principal parties establishment or like the ruling parties of the KDP and PUK, as well as the existing opposition parties and the newly created blocs or coalitions that were contesting these elections, corroborated that the process was very smooth, and in the lead up to the election, there wasn't any major issues in a sense of, for example, harassment of the smaller political parties, or like dissident politicians or activists, or the opposition political parties and coalitions. So it was a largely smooth process in the lead up to the election. And as you also rightly mentioned, the most perhaps significant challenge was that to have these elections take place after they were originally due in 2022. Now, if I take our listeners and our followers back to the origin of the disagreements that led to the postponement, actually multiple postponements, was at the heart of it was disagreements about the election legal system. So all the elections that happened in the Kurdistan region, as I was alluding to earlier, had taken place with Kurdistan region being maybe except this one in a single electoral constituency, i.e. the whole Kurdistan region of Iraq was one electoral constituency. But in the last 2-3 years, there has been a major development, particularly among the PUK and some other smaller parties, that they wanted to break that legal system to something that was akin to the election law of Iraq, which basically was one of the key demands of the protest movement in 2000, 2019. So i.e. breaking that one electoral constituency of the whole Kurdistan region to smaller constituencies where each province or governorate of the Kurdistan region is one electoral constituency. So that was one of the main disagreements. But there were other disagreements that ultimately lead to multiple postponements. So, but what happened in between 2022 and now, of course, there was a period of persistent disunity, especially between the two principal parties of KDP and PUK. And that obviously has a lot of consequences on day-to-day governance of the Kurdistan region, because these are not only the two dominant political parties, but they are also in a coalition government that goes back all the way to 2016, to 2006. So they are the two, I should say, principal, but also games in town in their respective strongholds on the north and eastern part of the region. So for any governance structure, a semblance governance and operation on a day-to-day basis, not least major reform programs, you need to have the consensus between these two major units in that political formula, which is KDP and PUK. And we've seen over the last 2 years, with the parliament being inactive, the Kurdistan regional government has been largely operating in a caretaker capacity, and arguably with dubious legal authority to introduce bills and measures and decrees and legislations. So that's a key problem that kind of resulted from these major various several postponements. And that also created, or this vacuum was also filled by a renewed push from the federal government of Iraq to insert itself in the affairs of the Kurdistan region as an autonomous entity from Iraq, because that is very, very significant. While the Kurdistan region is a part of Iraq, but at the same time, for many, many affairs, it has largely been not part of Iraq. For example, when it comes to security arrangement, arranging its own affairs, elections, security, day-to-day governance structures. But for the last 2 years, this vacuum, in the absence of having a parliament that is active, that the Kurdistan regional government that has the authority to introduce legislations and so forth, allowed an opportunity to the federal government to insert itself in the Kurdistan region's affairs. And that has, for example, played out in various fronts. For example, there has been several rulings from the Federal Supreme Court of Iraq that many analysts and observers, and myself included, have interpreted as attempts by Iraqi forces to shrink the Kurdish autonomy within Iraq. So, for example, the first election that took place in 1992, the Kurds arranged it and organized it themselves without any assistance from Iraq. But now this last election, ironically, because in the absence of institutions of the Kurdistan region, which they were suspended as a result of the stalemate and the persistent disunity between the KDP and PUK, the very Kurdish forces that established that autonomy had to go back to Iraq and ask Iraq to organize the election for the Kurdistan region. But that's actually, to put it in a very not so blunt way, but in the other extremes, we have seen major rulings that kind of targeted or attempted to shrink the Kurdish autonomy. For example, a ruling that invalidated all the contracts that the KRG had signed with international oil companies. But what I'm trying to say here, as a result of major postponements, the main institutions of governance, such as the parliament, was put into recess, and the government was in a caretaker capacity with very limited or actually dubious legal authority. And there was a vacuum as a result that allowed an opportunity to the federal government and the Shia forces in Iraq to attempt to shrink further the Kurdish autonomy in Iraq, which goes back to the fallout from the referendum that happened in 2017, that since then there has been repeated attempts from federal Iraq to put basically Kurdish gains, roll back Kurdish gains, and to put kind of constraints on the capacity of the Kurds to be able to exercise their right of self-governance, which is enshrined in the 2005 Constitution. So the main significance of this election was in itself to have the elections, but of course the next big challenge is to respect the will of the voters and form a government soon after, so that the government can tend to all the challenges and the necessities and priorities that the Kurdistan region needs to turn itself into.
Wow, great analysis. Shivan, you mentioned a de facto uh, power sharing agreement that has been in place between the KDP and PUK. Now, the KDP, for our viewers who may not be familiar with those terms, it stands for Kurdistan Democratic Party of the Barzanis, which is largely based in Erbil and Duhok, part of Iraqi Kurdistan. And PUK stands for Patriotic Union of Kurdistan of the Talabanis, based largely in Süleymaniye province of the region. Now, these two major political camps and blocs, I think many of us are quite familiar with this. But tell us, I understand that about a dozen of different political parties actually competed and participated in the most recent elections. Help us understand who is who and who stands for what in the Kurdistan region.
Yeah, that's a very crucial question to turn into. In addition to the two principal parties that we mentioned, that have a history in the power sharing in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, but also before the coalition between the two of them that started in 2005 after the US invasion, also ruling over their separate areas in the Kurdistan region that basically was the result of the civil war that split the region into two that I alluded to earlier. So in addition of these two principal parties, we also have the movement for change, or Goran movement, which was a splinter party that split from the PUK in 2009 by the former Deputy Secretary General of the PUK, Noshirwan Mustafa. So in 2009, the PUK rose, in fact, as a major challenger to the ruling duopoly of the KDP and PUK by winning a third of the parliamentary seats at the time. And in the second election that Goran participated in 2013, they managed to keep their hold of their voter share. So basically for almost 8 to 10 years, they were a strong feature of Kurdish politics. But in addition to Goran and Movement for Change, we also have a New Generation, or Noé Noué. And that was largely a movement that formed during or in the lead up to the referendum for independence in 2017, that they were the only force or the only kind of movement to campaign for not for now, for the referendum. So they were kind of breaking from the consensus or from the rest of the political parties that, despite having reservations about the timing of the referendum, they still went with it. But the New Generation at the time, in the lead up to the referendum, were the only movement that campaigned against the referendum, that they were calling it as a ill-timed. And I think in the wake of the referendum, and given the fallout from the referendum, that was basically Iraqi forces retaking the oil-rich city of Kirkuk and the other disputed territories that the Kurds had brought under their control in the context of the war against IS, and also the regional pressure, not only from Iraq, but also from the regional countries like Iran and Turkey, that were pushing back the Kurdish gains from Iraq. I think the voters rewarded New Generation at the time in 2018 for basically being apt and tactful, and basically having realized the risks of that gambit that later didn't basically pay out. So I think that's why they have managed to establish themselves to some extent as the only opposition movement in recent years, but they also have the access to resources and media channels and outlets, and to some extent also, I would say, a patronage, kind of resources that they can disperse, which is also a strong feature of Kurdish politics. So in addition to basically KDP, PUK, and Goran and New Generation, there is also two kind of Islamist-leaning political parties. There is the Kurdistan Islamic Union, and also the other one being Justice Group, which was formerly called Islamic Group. So these were kind of the formula before going to this election. So two principal ruling parties and four smaller opposition parties. But this election actually saw also two new entrants into the political scene in the Kurdistan region. Perhaps the one that was the most noteworthy in the lead up to the election was the People's Front, or Baregal, which was established by the former co-leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, Lahor Talabani. And so Lahor is not only the cousin of the incumbent president of the PUK, but he's also the nephew of the Imam Jalal Talabani. And in 2000, 4 years ago, when PUK had its party congress after the death of Imam Jalal, he rose as the uncontested leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. But despite that, he agreed to a sharing of power, or like a co-leadership of the PUK. But in 2021, a power struggle between the two cousins, Pavel Talabani and Lahor Talabani, resulted in the ouster of Lahor Talabani. So Lahore, 2 years ago, or in 2021, I think, after his ouster, established this new political party to basically claim what he, I suppose, might argue his righteous claim to power and at least in the Suleimaniya region, or the eastern part of the Kurdistan region. And the other new entrant to the political scene was the National Stance movement, which were some political activists, and among them were dissidents. Some of them were actually arrested in recent years when they were trying to protest for or against the salary delays, which has been also a major challenge for the Kurdistan region as a result of Erbil Baghdad disputes over resource sharing, but also some other former MPs from the Movement for Change, or Goran movement. So give and take, there was 8 to 9 main political parties and smaller kind of political opposition groups, and also independent candidates that kind of entered to contest this election.
If I understand you correctly, I think when you look at the scale, the number of different political parties that participated in these elections, so the KDP and the PUK and the New Generation movement came out as the most powerful three, the top three political parties in the race. Now, the KDP, if I understand correctly, is more of a nationalist and conservative political party. The PUK is more of secular, liberal, also nationalist political party. The New Generation movement, you will have to describe the New Generation movement. How does it relate to this being nationalist and secularist? I understand it's probably much closer to the PUK than it is to the KDP.
That's a very good question, and a good way to portray that. If we start perhaps maybe from the lesser known of the three, I would say the New Generation is very difficult to put in a box for various reasons. First of all, its leader doesn't have any background or kind of a long history, so to speak, in the political movement in the Kurdistan region, or in the politics of the Kurdistan region. And I was trying to allude to earlier that He saw an opportunity, I suppose, in the lead up to the 2017 referendum for independence to campaign against the referendum that advocated that it's ill-timed and the fallout could be dangerous for the Kurdistan region. And he could only, I suppose, do that because it's led. So the guy is a real estate, we could call it a developer or a magnate, and he has established a TV network that is obviously key to be able to propagate your political campaign and messaging and propaganda in this case. And given the fact that the fallout from the referendum was so drastic and resolute, I suppose people might have associated some form of political acumen to this guy. But at the same time, what is puzzling is a lot of people also realize that not only that the leader of the new generation doesn't have a long history or any history, actually, so to speak, in the Kurdish politics of Iraq, but also he doesn't come across as a charismatic or visionary or to have any kind of policy preferences or stance on many governance challenges in the Kurdistan region. But actually, if anything, he comes across as taunting the same criticism that many average people on a day-to-day basis have against the ruling duopoly of the KDP and PUK, i.e. bad governance or ill administration of the Kurdistan region, corruption, and basically monopoly over lucrative resources, and of course the result of that being a lot of unemployment and declining provision of basic services and so forth. So he has been campaigning in this election and in the previous election on some of these points and rhetorics rather than on basically what Kurds need to do or like massive overhaul of the political system in the Kurdistan region, or actually the relations between the federal Kurdistan region vis-a-vis the federal Iraq. So it has been difficult to put him in a box apart from campaigning on some populist, but at the same time, core grievances of day-to-day people in the Kurdistan region. When it comes to the other two political parties, I suppose the fallout from the referendum, which also kind of has been in line with the passing of the torch from the first generation of the Talabani and Barzanis to the next generation of the within these two parties, perhaps also kind of led to more acrimony and disunity between the KDP and PUK. So it's important to recall that having had a history to both work together and fight against each other, the Talabani and also Barzani, both, for example, in the 70s and in the 80s, and then, of course, after the establishment of the de facto Kurdistan region following the Gulf War and then the Kurdish-led self-rule, they also fought each other, but they couldn't eliminate each other. So the opportunities that the US invasion and the toppling of the Ba'ath regime presented itself to the Kurds, they seized upon it, and they were pragmatic. They put aside, I suppose, their differences, and they managed to kind of merge their two previously one-party-led administrations. And with that, actually, they managed to enshrine some of the Kurdish long-held aspirations in the Iraq's 2005 constitution. Now, we know what happened since the referendum. President Talabani passed away not too long after the referendum, and he was quite ill, in fact, 3-4 years before the referendum in 2017. And following the referendum and its aftermath, President Barzani resigned from politics. He's obviously still the leader of the KDP. And now we've seen in their stead a new generation of Talabani and Barzanis to come to the political scene. And in fact, not only that they were present before, but they were not calling the shots on a day-to-day basis. Now we see that in the KDP, the Prime Minister, Masroor Barzani, who's the incumbent and most likely going to be the Prime Minister again in the next government, managing the day-to-day affairs, not only in the cabinet, but also of the party. And in the PUK, we see, particularly after the ouster of Lahor Talabani, that Pavel Talabani, or Imam Jalal's elder son, has rose as the president of the PUK. And a lot of observers, analysts, and myself included, have seen some form of reluctance between the two to find compromise and sometimes go for outright measures vis-a-vis one another. And this lack of compromise and created more disunity and bickering, I suppose, between the two parties. And as I was alluding to earlier, has also gave an opportunity for Iraq, federal government of Iraq, to insert itself in the affairs of the Kurdistan region, which is a new feature of Kurdish politics that can only be argued that goes back to the fallout from the referendum, but nothing earlier.
Wow, wonderful. Now, another interesting outcome of these elections, for me as an outside observer, was Islamist political parties did not really do very well. They have been somewhat small parties from the beginning, and their vote share, their support from the electorate did not necessarily increase. That's an interesting outcome of Kurdistan elections. So the number one, number two, and number three largest political parties tend to be secular nationalist political parties. Um, so, but none of these political parties has enough seats in the parliament to actually form a majority government. So that means they must share power. They must form a coalition government. Who do you think, and how do you think this coalition government is going to be formed?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. This is going to be a number one challenge, especially if the two main parties are not willing to compromise. Um, Obviously, not only that they are the two main winners of the election, KDP having won the plurality of these of the seats and of course the votes as well, and then PUK in the second. The two of them together also are, as I was mentioning earlier, the only game in town in their respective strongholds. So the biggest challenge is a government without either of them will not have a sway over the entirety of the Kurdistan region. And we've seen, in fact, in recent years, amid increasing tensions between the KDP and its coalition partner, PUK, led to, for example, the boycotting of the cabinet meetings by the deputy prime minister, who's the younger son of Talabani and a major politician in the PUK, Kubat Talabani. And that boycott lasted for almost 6 months in the entirety of the previous cabinet. So, and that created a big challenge for the authority or for the cabinet or the government measures to be implemented across the region. So if you have reform measures and development initiatives or any other actually decree from the cabinet or even legislation from the parliament, if they are not implemented in entirety across the Kurdistan region, its territories, it will not have long sway. So even if these policies are very necessary, are very kind of a priority for the Kurdistan region, it's critical for the two parties to be on board. So, or to put it in other way, in other words, is actually the collection. It could lead to collective action problem. So it doesn't make. It will not have any effect if that rule can only be functioning in Erbil and Suleiman and Duhok, but not in Suleimania and Halabja, and vice versa. So that's why it's crucial that we keep in mind that while in the parliamentary machinations, the KDP with its plurality of votes can form the cabinet with, say, for example, the New Generation, or for example, with 2, 3 smaller political parties that won seats in this most recent election. But realistically, it will face a lot of challenges to be able to kind of enforce its measures and decrees and legislations across the whole region. And we've seen actually also in the lead up to the election that one of perhaps the flagship measures of the previous government, which is called My Account initiative, which is a salary domiciliation initiative to basically digitalize and kind of modernize the payroll account in the Kurdistan region, that the KDP came out against that and did not want it to be implemented in the eastern part of the region, which is in Sulaymaniyah and also in Halabja. So this in itself is a telling snippet of that if the two parties are not on board and not on consensus, then any stance against that could undermine the very policy initiatives that the Kurdistan region needs urgently to be able to have efficient economy or kind of a digitalized payroll, and I don't know, perhaps streamline its bureaucracy, but also to introduce other long overdue reform measures that the region might need. So the machinations. While it's a possibility that the KDP can form a government without the PUK, but realistically that is a far-fetched and it's very unlikely. And when it comes to the differences between, as you were also pointing to, the differences between these kind of the three main groupings and the smaller political parties, I think the Islamist parties in the Kurdistan region have around 10 to 11 to 12% or maximum 15% of the vote share. But at the same time, it's important to remember that neither the KDP nor the PUK have come out outright as secular political parties in a Western sense. That, for example, we've seen the KDP and PUK also taunt kind of religious undertones in their electoral campaigning. Most certainly, the PUK has done that in the lead up to this election. And we've also seen both parties field imams, actually, or Islamist figures as part of their list for the election. So ideologically, it's very, very difficult to see any major differences between these political parties. But having said that, I suppose KDP distinguishes itself from the rest as championing for basically Kurdish gains in Iraq. That goes back to 1992, and certainly, of course, after the drafting and the ratification of the constitution that gave the Kurds de jure autonomy within Iraq, and does not want to relinquish some of these hard-fought gains, and in fact, more often than not, has equated disunity, or actually when political parties are not on board with that vision, as we've seen with accusations that people are breaking with the rank. And again, I think all of this is a development from the fallout from the referendum of independence. We've seen that the KDP, again, under this, as I was mentioning earlier, the new generation within the two political parties and their lack of compromise is also that basically a new generation within the KDP has some feeling that it can rule over the Kurdistan region in its entirety without the necessity of the 50-50 or equal power sharing that has been in place since 2005 and 6, and then the PUK has been trying to force itself and it is a rival KDP to respect the existing kind of balance and also the existing agreement. And I think this is the challenge here, that if it's about self-interest and lack of consensus, that means more vacuum and more missteps could lead to more opportunities to Iraq to insert further itself in the affairs of the Kurdistan region.
Now, I am going to ask, my final question has to do with the United States of America. On my desk, I am holding this sticker which says, I voted, I am an early voter. Yesterday, now about 10 days ago, Kurdistan had its multi-party elections, and about 10 days from today, the United States is going to elect a new president. And yesterday, I waited in the line for about 2 hours to actually cast my vote. I have to say that is the only line I actually enjoy waiting in, because I actually, in the United States, we also have an option of mailing our vote. But I enjoy exercising my democratic rights and by actually waiting in the line for about 2 hours and to cast my vote. So I did it yesterday. In about 10 days, the United States may be a different country, depending on who actually wins these elections. How do you see the United States' role in accomplishing, perhaps forming a coalition government to stabilizing the Iraqi Kurdish politics? And do you anticipate any major policy changes towards the Kurds and Kurdish people and Kurdistan region in the next year or so? I know this is a lot to cover, but
Yeah.
please go ahead.
No, that's actually a very important question, and perhaps for our viewers and the followers, it's
Mhm.
important to also underline how for many Kurds, especially Kurds from Iraq, they see their fate being intertwined with the U.S. and also particularly with U.S. involvement slash interventions in the Middle East. And I think the relations between the Kurds and the US goes back to at least early 1970s, when the Kurds, at the time actually, the Kurdish movement was receiving support from the US, particularly, I suppose, Nixon administration and also from Iran. And also most recently, of course, in the fight against IS for the Kurdistan region to defend its territories from the evil aggression of the so-called Islamic State. But of course, there has been ups and downs in this in Kurdish dealings or interactions with the U.S. For example, in the 70s, not soon after that Iran and Iraq managed to resolve their border disputes, the U.S. ceased from providing support to the Kurds. That is kind of mostly referred to as the origin of the Kurdish betrayal and so forth. That
Mhm.
happened in 1991 after the defeat of Iraq from the Gulf War, and also obviously after the Kurdish referendum for independence in 2017. So we have both major interventions from US in Iraq and also in the Middle East, leading to Kurdish gains, as we saw in 1991, that the Kurds managed to kind of carve out a de facto space for themselves to establish their self-rule in northern Iraq, and a decade or so later, after 2003, to translate that into de jure autonomy and enshrine that in the constitution of Iraq, and to be recognized as a federal region in Iraq. So, having outlined this historical kind of precedence, I think the involvement and the nudging diplomatically and openly and otherwise by the U.S. is crucial for the two main principal parties in the Kurdistan region to put their kind of bickering or disunity aside, and to basically focus on the sticks. And sometimes, in fact, the average citizenry in the Kurdistan region, or the average people in the Kurdistan region, would like to see that more. But of course, the average people might not be familiar with the conduct of diplomacy and how much and when would US officials will come out openly on how much they will actually challenge and nudge Kurdish politicians and the KDP and PUK basically behind closed doors or kind of through their diplomatic channels. So it's obviously very crucial for the Kurdish people to see this engagement and the US pressure and support to be ongoing. But at the same time, I suppose the Kurdish people and its political parties would like to see a framework and a structure for that. For example, we've seen for the last several years that the KDP and PUK and the Kurdistan regional government receiving support from the US government to reform and professionalize its Peshmerga forces, which is the defense mechanism of the Kurdistan region, as part of Iraq's overall defense mechanism. But by the very admission of the Kurdish officials, the progress has been negligible, and it has been very slow and not steady. And that is, it's an open secret that is as a result of the ongoing disagreements between the two main parties. And that's why any reform initiative will be viewed in light of the relations between the KDP and PK. So it's very important that the support will continue, but at the same time, it is conditioned with some form of progress in the case of the Peshmerga reform. But at the same time, the same thing can apply to other areas. For example, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the provision of basic vital services. So in many aspects, in recent years, as a result of the economic crisis and the challenges that trace back to the disputes between Erbil and Baghdad government, the grievances in the Kurdistan region or dissent in the Kurdistan region has been on the rise. While on the one hand, the KRI has been seen as the hope for the remainder of Iraq and a beacon of hope, an island of decency, but then these disagreements, the ongoing disunity, has also had impact on governance and the administration that again gave rise to dissent and grievances among the public. So it's important that the US officials will continue to nudge support, but at the same time also condition their support and nudge the Kurdish political parties and the two principal one that they need to do better and that they need to put aside their differences and to compromise. That is one. And the second thing is obviously in relation to the relations between the Kurdistan region and also the federal government in Baghdad. So for a lot of Kurds, they see some form of anxiety every time that there is an interference from federal government in the affairs of the Kurdistan region. So even when the opportunity presents itself to federal government, that this has been something of a new, because for the large part over the last 3 decades, the Kurds have been in charge of their own affairs. So when they see a strong interference from federal government in the region's affairs, it leads to some form of anxiety that there might be attempts by federal forces to shrink Kurdish autonomy. And in fact, that also means the renegement of a commitment in Iraq as a whole of ethno-sectarian power sharing, where the new Iraq needs to be a co-ruled or kind of in consensus, in a coalition of the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis. So any such interference would be interpreted and has been interpreted, in fact, by the public as well as in the among the political parties as a renegement from that agreement of power sharing or that pact of power sharing and ruling the new Iraq altogether. And we've seen that more often than not, this leading to grievances in large segments of the population in Iraq, for example, among the Sunnis, that they see a lot of these kind of attempts at renegement from that. But also, and this anxiety has also spread among the Kurdish public that, well, you cannot punish the Kurdistan region because of long-standing disputes between Erbil and Baghdad. You can say because Kurdistan region has been exporting oil, or the Kurdistan region is not following certain federal rules or structures. So you cannot equate of basically rolling back what the Kurds see as hard-fought gains, rights as part of the new Iraq, because of the challenges that the federal government is facing with a federal entity, which has been strained as a result of this unity between the KDP and PUK. Because for the large part, in the first decade after 2003, when the KDP and PUK were in more consensus, they did not present such opportunities for Baghdad to interfere in the Kurdish affairs. And in fact, they were, by many accounts, were mediating forces in Iraq and in the federal level between the Shias and Sunnis over power sharing, and they managed to break through some of the key stalemates and political paralysis. But in recent years, as a result of lack of consensus and unity between the two principal parties, we've seen, in fact, more often than not, political paralysis and deadlock in the Kurdistan region that once again presents opportunities for Iraq to interfere in Kurdish affairs. And that's why it's crucial for the United States and for other diplomatic missions in the Kurdistan region to continue to work and to nudge the Kurdish officials and the two principal parties that they cannot sacrifice, and they cannot also at the same time take it for granted some of those rights that are enshrined in the constitution of Iraq.
Thank you very much. I started this conversation by welcoming you in Kurdish. I would like to end this conversation by thanking you in Kurdish. Shivan Fazil. Thank you very much for your time and insights.
Zor Spas, and it was great to be with you again. Thanks for having me.